Some were carved into inaccessible peaks, and others were deliberately buried underground. They bear no names, leave no instructions, and offer no explanations. Silent monuments, they have endured while cities have vanished, peoples have changed, and ways of life themselves have transformed. The question isn't who built them, but rather, why were they designed to endure, not to be seen? In this video, we won't visit just one monument, but a series of places that chose silence, height, or burial instead of visibility. We will try to understand what connects them. Why was stone preferred? Why were height or depth chosen? And why did the meaning persist even after their creators were forgotten? If you appreciate history that doesn't offer ready-made answers, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. The Tatul Thracian Rock Sanctuary is carved into a solitary rocky hill that rises distinctly above the surrounding valley, its silhouette visible long before its details can be understood. From a distance, the hill already appears shaped, its stepped profile and smooth surfaces signaling human intervention layered onto a naturally prominent form. Composed of volcanic tuff, a relatively soft and workable stone, the hill offered an ideal surface for carving without the need for large-scale construction. Archaeological evidence indicates that human activity at Tatul began in the Late Bronze Age and intensified during the Thracian period as the site developed into a complex ceremonial center. Rather than expanding outward, the sanctuary evolved vertically. At its core stands a rock-cut, pyramid-like structure, its summit flattened and deliberately shaped. Shallow channels and niches encircle this upper platform, suggesting rituals conducted in the open, fully exposed to sky, wind, and weather. Below the summit, a sequence of carved terraces, stairways, and chambers descends the slope. Movement through the sanctuary is directed upward rather than inward, reinforcing ascent as a symbolic act. Approaching the summit requires physical effort and deliberate progression, turning motion itself into part of the ritual experience. Excavations have uncovered traces of fire use, ceramic fragments, and animal remains, pointing to repeated ceremonial gatherings rather than continuous or permanent habitation. The absence of domestic structures underscores the site's separation from everyday life. One of Tatul's most distinctive features is a rock-cut tomb carved directly into the hill beneath the summit platform. This placement has led many researchers to suggest a connection with hero cults or elite veneration, where burial and ritual were not separated but integrated within the same sacred landscape. Classical sources describing Thracian belief systems emphasize the permeability between the worlds of the living and the dead. Tatul's architecture appears to embody this concept spatially, with ritual spaces layered above a chamber intended to receive the dead. The living ascended toward the summit, while the deceased remained within the rock itself, binding remembrance, ritual, and landscape into a single vertical composition. Over time, additional modifications were introduced. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, fortification elements were added, yet these later interventions adapted themselves to the existing carved form rather than replacing it. Walls and defensive features follow the contours of the hill, preserving the sanctuary's original structure and symbolic logic. Geological analysis reveals that many carved surfaces were deliberately smoothed, their edges rounded through sustained use. This suggests that the sanctuary was not shaped once and abandoned, but maintained and refined across generations. The stone bears subtle traces of repeated contact, marking Tatul as a place of return rather than a singular event. From its elevated position, the sanctuary commands wide views of surrounding roots and valleys, situating it within networks of movement and visibility. Such placement would have enhanced its ceremonial significance, making it both a landmark and a destination. Unlike enclosed temples, Tatul remains open and exposed, its ritual architecture inseparable from the landscape itself. Sacred space here is defined by place and elevation rather than by walls.
The lack of inscriptions or explicit iconography leaves its precise functions open to interpretation. However, the repetition of niches, channels, and platforms suggests offerings, libations, and possibly observations tied to seasonal cycles. Some scholars note that Tatul's form predates the widespread use of monumental stone architecture in the region, aligning it with earlier traditions that focused on shaping natural outcrops rather than constructing freestanding buildings. This continuity complicates chronological boundaries. Later cultures inherited a site already charged with meaning and adapted it to their own rituals without erasing its earlier identity. In landscapes affected by erosion, deforestation, and shifting settlement patterns, elevated sanctuaries like Tatul would have remained stable reference points, preserving continuity amid change. While there is no evidence directly linking Tatul to memories of floods or large-scale environmental catastrophe, its emphasis on height, permanence, and the integration of burial within ritual space suggests an enduring concern with stability, renewal, and remembrance. The sanctuary does not present itself as a monument to a single ruler or moment. Instead, it stands as a cumulative expression of belief shaped over centuries, its stone surfaces carrying the quiet imprint of repeated return. As light moves slowly across its carved steps and the valley below shifts with season and time, Tatul continues to occupy its hilltop with restraint. It offers no declarations and no inscriptions, only the persistent suggestion that meaning was once drawn here from elevation, endurance, and the careful shaping of stone that outlasted those who carved it.
Perperikon rises from the eastern Rhodope Mountains, where ancient volcanic rock pushes through forested slopes and the Arda River curves quietly below. Seen from afar, it does not announce itself as a single monument or a clearly defined structure. Instead, it reveals itself as an entire stone landscape, shaped slowly over immense spans of time, where cliffs, terraces, chambers, and walls appear to grow naturally from the bedrock itself. Its surfaces are weathered, its carvings softened by age, blurring the line between what was formed by geology and what was shaped by human hands. Archaeological evidence suggests human presence here as early as the late Neolithic period. The naturally fractured rhyolite of the hill provided both shelter and a sense of symbolic elevation long before formal architecture emerged. Even in these earliest phases, the stone was not merely occupied but actively transformed. Rock was hollowed, smoothed, and aligned into platforms, basins, stairways, and niches whose original purposes remain only partially understood, hinting at ritual behaviors that predate written history. Over centuries and then millennia, Thracian communities reshaped the summit into a major sacred center. They carved a vast central hall directly into the living rock, its surfaces worn smooth by repeated use. Ancient authors later associated this place with an oracle of Dionysus, said to speak through fire, wine, and ecstatic ritual. While such accounts come from much later sources, they find echoes in the physical layout of the site itself. Altars carved into stone, channels designed to guide liquids across carefully sloped surfaces, and spaces clearly intended for ceremonial gathering rather than domestic life. Yet even these classical associations rest upon foundations far older. In the deepest cuts of the rock, subtle differences in tool marks can still be seen. They are broader, less precise, and distinct from later Thracian, Hellenistic, or Roman workmanship. These early marks suggest techniques and intentions that do not fully align with the architectural logic of historical temples, pointing instead toward a prehistoric tradition of carving stone for symbolic rather than structural reasons. As Perperikon expanded, it was never entirely rebuilt or erased. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, fortifications were added, but they enclosed earlier sacred spaces instead of replacing them. Religious, administrative, and residential functions began to overlap within the same carved terrain.
Streets were etched directly into the rock, doorways were cut flush with cliff faces. Entire rooms were excavated rather than constructed, dissolving the boundary between architecture and geology in a way rarely seen elsewhere. Water management features appear throughout the complex. Cisterns, channels, and basins are scattered across the site, some clearly Roman in design, others far more ambiguous. Many are positioned where rainfall naturally collects, suggesting that water was not only a practical necessity, but a ritual concern from the earliest phases of occupation. The careful control of water, guiding it across stone surfaces and into carved basins, seems to have carried symbolic meaning long before it served everyday needs. The sheer scale of excavation raises questions archaeology can only partially answer. Shaping such massive volumes of stone would have required sustained labor and long-term planning. Yet clear evidence of dense, permanent habitation is absent in the earliest layers. This has led many researchers to suggest that Perperikon may have functioned initially as a ceremonial center, drawing seasonal or pilgrimage populations rather than supporting a permanent city.
Geological studies reveal that the hill itself is a naturally fractured volcanic outcrop, making it unusually workable but also inherently unstable. Erosion, seismic activity, and later dismantling have likely erased entire sections of the site. What survives today may represent only a fraction of what once existed, complicating efforts to reconstruct its original scale or layout. In the Byzantine and medieval periods, builders continued to reuse the site, constructing churches and defensive walls that often followed the lines of much older carvings. In doing so, they preserved alignments whose original meanings had already faded from memory. This continuity makes precise dating difficult, especially in areas where sacred use may have persisted uninterrupted for thousands of years, dissolving the boundary between prehistoric ritual and historical religion. Some researchers have identified possible astronomical orientations among certain platforms and sightlines, particularly towards solar extremes, such as solstices. However, erosion and later modifications make definitive conclusions elusive. These observations remain suspended between careful measurement and interpretive restraint, suggesting intention without fully proving it. The idea that Perperikon predates what we conventionally define as Thracian culture is supported by radiocarbon dates from nearby habitation layers and ceramic fragments. Yet the deepest carved features remain resistant to direct dating. Their age can only be inferred through context, comparison, and geological analysis. This uncertainty has encouraged broader speculation, including connections to distant memories of environmental upheaval, periods when rising waters or climatic shifts reshaped settlement patterns across southeastern Europe. While no direct evidence links Perperikon to any single flood event, its elevated position, long occupation, and persistent ritual emphasis on water invite reflection. It may represent a place of continuity during times of instability, a high sanctuary preserved while lowland sites disappeared, offering both physical refuge and symbolic order. What remains clear is that Perperikon defies simple classification. It is neither purely natural nor fully constructed, neither entirely prehistoric nor comfortably historical. It is a cumulative imprint of human intention, carved repeatedly into the same enduring stone. Each era left its mark while inheriting what it could not erase, creating a true palimpsest in which origins always seem just beyond reach. As wind moves through its carved corridors and sunlight slides slowly across its stone surfaces, Perperikon continues to suggest that its deepest story does not belong to any single civilization. Instead, it belongs to the enduring human impulse to return to the same rock generation after generation and carve meaning into it again and again.
Carved high into a sheer limestone cliff overlooking the Madara Plateau, the Madara rider reveals itself suddenly, emerging from the rock face with a restrained authority that feels both intentional and curiously distant from its surroundings. The image appears designed not for close inspection, but to be seen from afar, suspended above the landscape in a way that commands attention through elevation rather than proximity. Its presence is unmistakable, yet deliberately removed from the human scale below. The relief depicts a mounted horseman in motion, spear lowered toward a lion beneath the hooves of the horse, while a dog runs behind in pursuit. The scene is rendered with a clarity and confidence that immediately distinguish it from ordinary commemorative carvings. Its scale, combined with its height, sets it apart from most ancient reliefs. Rather than standing on a plinth or occupying a civic space, the rider was cut directly into the vertical cliff face, approximately 23 meters above the ground. Achieving this would have required extensive planning, scaffolding, and coordination, pointing to an organized authority capable of mobilizing skilled labor and executing a carefully conceived symbolic vision. Most scholars date the carving to the early medieval period, commonly associating it with the First Bulgarian Empire of the late 7th or early 8th century. The rider is often identified as a ruler, most plausibly Khan Tervel, a conclusion supported by Greek inscriptions carved nearby in later centuries that commemorate military victories and political events. These inscriptions, however, post-date the relief itself, suggesting that the image already held significance before it was formally contextualized through written record. Despite these associations, the rider resists easy classification within known Byzantine or steppe artistic traditions. Its composition blends elements of classical naturalism with something more restrained and archaic. The forms are controlled rather than exuberant, lacking the ornamental density typical of imperial propaganda. This restraint gives the image a timeless quality, one that feels less concerned with narrative detail than with conveying authority, dominance, and order. The cliff into which the relief is carved was not a neutral surface. Long before the rider existed, this rock formation formed part of a broader sacred landscape. The surrounding area is dotted with caves, niches, and rock sanctuaries that had been used since antiquity, if not earlier. This continuity suggests that the choice of location carried inherited meaning beyond political display. The rider did not create significance here, it absorbed and redefined it. Weathering patterns across the relief reveal centuries of exposure to wind, rain, and temperature shifts. Many finer details have softened or vanished entirely, yet the posture of the horseman remains unmistakable, frozen in a moment that feels symbolic rather than narrative. The scene does not unfold, it asserts itself. What survives is not motion, but intention. Notably absent is any architectural framework surrounding the relief. There are no temples, platforms, or contemporary inscriptions framing its message. The image stands alone, unsupported by constructed space, implying that the carving itself was the focal point rather than part of a larger monumental complex. This isolation deepens the mystery of its purpose and reception. Some researchers have observed traces of earlier modifications or carvings on the cliff face, now eroded beyond recognition. This raises the possibility that the rider occupies a surface already shaped or revered in earlier periods, perhaps intentionally overriding or inheriting an older sacred marker. The surrounding plateau contains evidence of Thracian activity, Roman roads, and early medieval settlements, creating a layered cultural landscape where symbols were reused, reinterpreted, and adapted rather than erased. This continuity complicates any attempt to interpret the Madara rider solely as a medieval political statement. Its elevated position and inaccessibility align more closely with traditions of prehistoric rock art, where images were placed beyond reach, visible yet untouchable, reinforcing authority through distance. In such contexts, elevation itself becomes a form of power. Geological studies indicate that the limestone cliff naturally fractures in horizontal bands, a feature that may have guided the placement of the relief. At the same time, this structure means that portions of the original carving may have been lost over time, subtly altering its proportions and visual balance. What we see today may not fully reflect the original composition, but rather a version shaped by erosion as much as by intention. The rider's orientation has been examined for possible astronomical or landscape alignments, though conclusions remain tentative. Erosion, combined with the absence of contemporary descriptions, limits certainty about its intended function. What is clearer is that later rulers recognized the image's authority. By adding inscriptions centuries after its creation, they sought to anchor their own legitimacy to an already powerful symbol, transforming the relief into a historical reference point. This act of reuse suggests that the Madara rider may have carried meanings even their medieval patrons did not fully understand. They inherited a site whose authority predated their own political structures. Speculation has occasionally linked the rider to much older mythic archetypes of divine horsemen found across Eurasia, figures associated with protection, fertility, and cosmic order. While such parallels remain comparative rather than evidentiary, they underscore the image's resonance beyond a single historical moment. More securely, the relief occupies a liminal position between epochs. It was carved during a period when older sacred landscapes were being absorbed into emerging states, preserving fragments of belief within new frameworks of power. The suggestion that such monuments might encode memories of earlier environmental or cultural upheavals has been raised cautiously, particularly given regional histories of population movement and climatic instability in late antiquity and earlier prehistory. Yet no direct evidence links the Madara rider to flood myths or cataclysmic events. What remains undeniable is its endurance. Elevated above the plateau, carved into living stone, the rider has outlasted the societies that surrounded it. It does not explain itself. It watches, fixed and silent, as centuries passed below, empires rising, dissolving, and leaving only traces behind. In that stillness lies its lasting power, not as a clear statement of origin or identity, but as a marker of continuity imposed upon a landscape already dense with memory. Whatever moment gave rise to the Madara rider, it was shaped as much by what had been forgotten as by what was remembered.
Beglik Tash lies quietly within a low coastal forest near Bulgaria's Black Sea shore, where oak trees grow between scattered limestone boulders and the land slopes gently toward what was once the ancient coastline. The place does not confront the visitor with walls or towers. Instead, it reveals itself gradually, as though the landscape itself has paused mid-gesture, inviting attention rather than demanding it. At first glance, Beglik Tash appears less like a constructed monument and more like a careful conversation with the terrain. Massive stones rest where nature left them, yet some have been subtly shifted, tilted, and stabilized with deliberate care. The site occupies a natural clearing filled with rounded limestone blocks, many weighing tens of tons, their surfaces shaped by wind and water long before human hands ever touched them. Archaeological evidence suggests that people began organizing this space during the late Bronze Age, continuing into the early Iron Age. The stones themselves, however, are vastly older. What sets Beglik Tash apart is not carving or decoration, but precision of placement. Select boulders were positioned in relation to one another to create narrow passages, raised platforms, and a central sacrificial stone pierced by a carefully shaped circular opening. Its edges are worn smooth, not by ornamentation, but by repeated contact over long periods of use. Unlike later Thracian sanctuaries that incorporate masonry walls, reliefs, or inscriptions, Beglik Tash relies almost entirely on alignment and spatial arrangement. Light, shadow, and seasonal change animate the site without the need for permanent architectural additions.
Researchers have noted that certain stones align with solar events, particularly the summer solstice sunrise, when light passes through natural gaps and illuminates specific surfaces within the complex. While scholars remain cautious about overstating intentionality, these alignments fit broader patterns of prehistoric observation rather than accidental coincidence. The absence of permanent habitation structures further suggests that Beglik Tash functioned as a ritual gathering place rather than a settlement. It was likely visited periodically by communities who did not see the stones as raw material to be reshaped, but as active participants in ceremony. Excavations have uncovered pottery fragments, animal bones, and traces of charcoal, indicating offerings, feasting, and ritual activity. These remains are sparse and widely spaced, reinforcing the impression that gatherings here were episodic and symbolic rather than continuous. The surrounding region shows evidence of long-term human presence, and the site's proximity to the ancient coastline may have heightened its importance, placing it between forest, open sky, and sea, a convergence of natural elements often associated with liminal ritual spaces.
Geological analysis reveals that while many stones lie close to their original positions, others were clearly moved and propped using smaller supports. This demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of leverage and balance, allowing enormous masses to be repositioned without extensive shaping. This reliance on raw stone distinguishes Beglik Tash from later monumental traditions and aligns it more closely with earlier megalithic landscapes across Europe, where meaning emerged through arrangement rather than transformation. The apparent simplicity of the site masks a complex choreography of movement and perception. Participants would have navigated between stones, passed through constricted openings, and emerged into open clearings. Their experience was shaped not only by what they saw, but by how their bodies moved through space. The circular opening in the central stone has been interpreted as a symbolic portal, a calendrical marker, or a feature associated with specific ritual acts. Its heavily worn edges suggest prolonged and repeated use rather than a single fixed function. Over time, the forest advanced and the stones slipped from collective memory. Lacking defensive, administrative, or residential roles, the site was never rebuilt or repurposed in later periods. Unlike places that accumulated layers of construction, Beglik Tash remained largely untouched, preserving a form of ritual expression that predates monumental architecture as it is usually understood. This isolation complicates precise dating. Organic materials are limited, and the stones themselves resist chronological analysis, leaving researchers dependent on contextual artifacts and comparative frameworks. Some scholars have suggested that the site reflects responses to environmental rhythms rather than expressions of political authority, framing it within broader prehistoric strategies of stability. Ritual gatherings may have reinforced social cohesion amid shifting coastlines and changing climatic conditions. There is no direct evidence linking Beglik Tash to memories of catastrophic flooding or dramatic sea level rise. Still, its placement near the ancient shore and its emphasis on elevated stone platforms invite reflection on how prehistoric communities marked enduring points within mutable environments. Stone endures where wood, soil, and lowland settlements do not, offering continuity through slow environmental change rather than sudden disaster. Beglik Tash thus occupies a quiet but profound position within Bulgaria's deep past. It announces nothing through walls or inscriptions. Its meaning is carried instead by alignment, movement, repetition, and return. Beneath filtered light and shifting leaves, the complex suggests a worldview in which permanence was achieved not by building upward or enclosing space, but by recognizing the enduring presence of stone and arranging it just enough to let the landscape itself become the monument.
The Sveshtari tomb lies hidden beneath a low earthen mound in the gently rolling landscape of northeastern Bulgaria. Nothing on the surface announces what rests below. The tomb reveals itself only through excavation, its carefully cut stone chambers concealed for centuries beneath layers of soil and vegetation. Entering the space feels less like discovering a ruin and more like crossing into a realm deliberately removed from the living world. Discovered in the late 20th century, the tomb is dated to the early Hellenistic period and is widely attributed to the Geats, a Thracian people whose elite burial traditions blended local belief systems with influences absorbed through sustained contact with the Greek world. Unlike many Thracian tombs that rely on painted decoration or long ceremonial corridors, the power of Sveshtari lies in architectural restraint and the unsettling presence of its sculpted forms. Along the chamber walls stand 10 female figures carved in high relief. They are neither fully human nor entirely vegetal. Their upper bodies resemble women, their arms raised as if bearing weight, while their lower forms dissolve into stylized plant shapes. These figures appear to support the chamber itself, merging anatomy with architecture and blurring the boundary between structure, symbol, and ritual meaning. They do not merely decorate the space, they participate in its function. Above them runs a carved frieze depicting mounted horsemen advancing toward a central figure. The scene suggests procession rather than conflict, continuity rather than finality. It freezes movement into permanence, implying a journey that extends beyond death rather than concluding with burial. The proportions of the chamber are precise and carefully calculated. Limestone blocks are fitted with deliberate accuracy, creating a space that feels both intimate and formal, engineered for endurance while remaining concealed from the world above. Archaeological evidence indicates that the tomb was intended for a high-ranking individual, possibly a ruler, and that it was sealed shortly after use. The entrance was deliberately concealed beneath the mound, discouraging reopening, as though permanence itself formed part of the funerary intent. Yet the mound into which the tomb was cut had already been sacred ground long before this burial. It belonged to a broader necropolis whose origins reach back into earlier Thracian ritual practices associated with ancestor veneration and the sanctity of landscape. This reuse of an already charged place follows a pattern seen throughout the region, where later elites anchored their authority within sites dense with inherited memory. The figures within the tomb are often compared to Greek caryatids, but the resemblance is superficial. Their garments follow Thracian iconographic traditions. Their faces are stylized rather than idealized, and their transformation into plant forms suggests a symbolic link between human life, the earth, and cyclical renewal rather than classical notions of aesthetic harmony. The absence of abundant grave goods, many of which were likely removed in antiquity, shifts attention away from wealth and towards space itself. Here, architecture functions as the primary ritual instrument. Meaning is conveyed through proportion, enclosure, and symbolic presence rather than material display.
Structural analysis reveals advanced planning and technical skill. The tomb required precise load distribution and sophisticated stone carving, indicating access to specialized knowledge and experienced labor. Yet this technical mastery coexists with symbolic choices that resist full explanation, particularly the decision to depict figures that appear both alive and immobilized, eternally engaged in sustaining the chamber above. Some scholars interpret the tomb as a mythic dwelling rather than a final resting place, a threshold space where the deceased transitions rather than disappears. Others view it as a symbolic model of cosmic order, with the central axis of the chamber positioning the ruler within a carefully structured universe. These interpretations differ, but all acknowledge that the tomb was designed to shape belief as much as to contain a body. The mound itself, rising gently above the plain, recalls burial traditions that stretch deep into prehistory,
when earth and stone were combined to mark passage between worlds. In this broader context, Sveshtari does not appear as an isolated innovation, but as a refined expression of concepts long embedded in the landscape. Geological studies confirm that the limestone used was sourced locally, reinforcing the idea that the tomb was meant to remain inseparable from its setting, bound to the land rather than imported or displaced. Its exceptional preservation, ensured by the protective mound and stable soil conditions, allows modern visitors to encounter the interior much as it was left. This creates the impression that its builders anticipated a distant future gaze, even as they worked to seal the tomb from intrusion. Speculation has occasionally extended beyond its accepted date, suggesting that certain symbolic features may echo far older belief systems rooted in communal memory and long-term survival through environmental change. While no evidence places the Sveshtari tomb outside known Thracian cultural frameworks, its deliberate concealment, structural permanence, and emphasis on cyclical imagery invite reflection on how societies respond to uncertainty by anchoring meaning beneath the earth. The tomb does not proclaim catastrophe or rebirth openly. Instead, it maintains silence. That silence, preserved across centuries, suggests a conception of time measured not in generations, but in deep continuity. Revealed only when modern excavation removed the soil above it, Sveshtari stands as a reminder that some of the most carefully constructed expressions of power and belief were never meant to be seen again, preserved not for memory, but for endurance, waiting quietly beneath the ground as the world above changed beyond recognition.
The ruins of ancient Pliska spread across the flat plains of northeastern Bulgaria, where the land opens wide and the horizon stretches without interruption. Nothing rises sharply from the ground. Instead, the city reveals itself gradually, not as a single dominant monument, but as an immense and carefully ordered expanse, whose true scale only becomes clear when followed across the fields. Founded in the late 7th century, Pliska served as the first capital of the Bulgarian state. In its earliest form, it was not a stone city, but an earthen and wooden settlement, enclosed by vast defensive works that reflected steppe traditions adapted to an unfamiliar and open landscape. The initial phase consisted of an enormous outer enclosure, defined by ditches and embankments, surrounding an area far larger than most contemporary urban centers. This scale suggests that Pliska functioned not only as a city, but as a symbolic domain, capable of absorbing people, herds, and resources during periods of instability. Within this outer enclosure, later stone walls were added, forming an inner city whose geometry reflects a growing emphasis on administrative order and permanence. Archaeological evidence shows a gradual transition from timber structures to monumental stone architecture. Over time, palaces, administrative buildings, and religious complexes emerged, marking a decisive shift from mobile authority toward a rooted and visibly centralized power. The most prominent of these later constructions is the Great Basilica, one of the largest early medieval churches in Europe. Its foundations were deliberately laid over earlier structures, signaling both religious and political transformation following the Christianization of the Bulgarian state in the 9th century. Yet beneath these visible remains lie traces of earlier occupation. Reused stone blocks, altered ground surfaces, and fragmented foundations hint at activity on the site before its formal establishment as a capital. The choice of Pliska's location has long puzzled researchers. Built on an open plain and far from mountainous terrain, it lacks the natural defenses typical of earlier Thracian strongholds. Instead, it relied on scale, planning, and artificial fortification. This openness may reflect confidence in centralized control, but it also suggests a response to environmental and social conditions in which space itself became a strategic resource, allowing visibility, movement, and rapid assembly.
Water management systems, including wells and channels, reveal careful planning in response to seasonal variation in an exposed landscape. These features underscore the importance of infrastructure in sustaining permanence where natural shelter was absent. Over time, Pliska was partially dismantled. Its stones were reused in later constructions as the political center shifted elsewhere, leaving behind a grid of foundations, roads, and earthworks that slowly merged back into agricultural land.
Unlike elevated sanctuaries or buried tombs, Pliska's ruins remained vulnerable to erosion, farming, and neglect. Their survival depended less on concealment than on sheer extent. Some researchers note that the earliest earthworks resembled defensive systems found far to the north and east, while others emphasize continuity with local construction traditions. Together, these perspectives highlight the hybrid nature of Pliska's regions, shaped by both incoming steppe influences and existing regional practices. Speculation about whether Pliska replaced an earlier settlement remains unresolved. The flat terrain offers few clear stratigraphic markers, and organic materials decay rapidly in the soil. In a broader sense, Pliska represents a different response to time and uncertainty than the rock sanctuaries and tombs that preceded it. Where earlier sites sought permanence through elevation, stone, or concealment, Pliska prioritized administrative reach, visibility, and spatial order. Even so, continuity remains evident. New structures were repeatedly built atop older ones rather than relocated, binding successive phases of authority to the same ground. While no credible evidence places Pliska outside known historical frameworks or associates it with prehistoric catastrophe, its sudden emergence at such scale has encouraged reflection on how societies reorganize space following periods of disruption. The rise of Pliska marks a turning point. Memory, belief, and authority were no longer embedded primarily in carved rock or hidden chambers, but in organized space and visible power. Today, the scattered remains of walls and foundations offer little immediate spectacle, yet taken together, they form a quiet counterpoint to earlier sacred landscapes, suggesting that the human impulse to endure can express itself as much through order, repetition, and administration as through stone, elevation, and ritual. Pliska does not whisper of lost ages hidden beneath mountains or sealed within tombs. Instead, it speaks of a moment when permanence was sought across open land, when the past was neither buried nor carved into rock, but absorbed into the groundwork of a new state, leaving behind a landscape where absence itself becomes the final trace of continuity. Belintash rises high on a flat-topped limestone plateau in the western Rhodope Mountains, a place where the land falls away abruptly on every side and the sky feels unusually close, almost pressing down onto the stone. Reaching it requires a long approach and steady ascent, and only once the plateau is fully gained do its features begin to reveal themselves. Nothing announces the sanctuary from afar. It unfolds slowly, through attention rather than spectacle. The surface of the plateau is etched with a network of shallow basins, channels, steps, and geometric cuts carved directly into the living rock. Time has softened their edges, rounding corners and smoothing lines, yet the overall precision remains unmistakable. These forms suggest deliberate planning and repetition rather than the randomness of erosion. Archaeological interpretation places the most visible phase of activity in the Thracian period, when elevated rock sanctuaries functioned as points of contact between human communities and the forces they observed, measured, and sought to negotiate. At the same time, the absence of datable organic material leaves the earliest phases unresolved, suspended somewhere between deep prehistory and early antiquity. Unlike enclosed sanctuaries, Belintash offers no walls, roofs, or constructed buildings. It presents only an open surface shaped for interaction with the elements. Rainwater gathers in carved depressions, then moves deliberately along channels toward the plateau's edge, turning rainfall into a visible and directed event rather than a passive occurrence.
The careful positioning of these basins suggests that water was not simply controlled, but closely observed. Its movement across the stone may have reinforced cycles tied to agriculture, timekeeping, and seasonal ritual. Some carvings align along straight axes, while others cluster in ways that imply repeated return to the same locations. Rather than introducing new forms, successive generations appear to have deepened existing cuts, refined shapes, and reaffirmed earlier markings. From the plateau, views extend across valleys and distant ridgelines, situating the sanctuary within a wide visual field that emphasizes its separation from daily life below. Geological studies indicate that the limestone fractures predictably, and some features clearly exploit natural fissures in the rock. Yet the regularity and placement of several basins and channels exceed what natural processes alone would create, reinforcing the conclusion of sustained and intentional human intervention. Belintash lacks the monumental drama of carved holes or towering standing stones. Its complexity lies instead in integration. The rock itself functions as both instrument and archive, recording interaction with wind, water, and light over long periods of time. No inscriptions or iconography survive to clarify its symbolic language, leaving interpretation dependent on form, placement, and comparison with other open-air sanctuaries across the Balkans. Some researchers have proposed astronomical roles for the site, noting possible alignments with solar or lunar events. However, erosion and later disturbance make precise verification difficult. As a result, these interpretations remain cautious, balanced between observation and restraint rather than firm conclusion. What most clearly distinguishes Belintash is the sense of accumulated attention embedded in its surface. The impression is not of a place built once and abandoned, but of a stone repeatedly returned to, listened to, tested, and marked incrementally. The absence of defensive structures or nearby permanent settlement suggests that the plateau was approached deliberately and temporarily, reinforcing its role as a liminal space rather than a center of political or military power. Over time, stories gathered around the site, including modern associations with unusual or unexplained phenomena. These narratives, however, reveal more about contemporary attempts to fill interpretive silence than about the sanctuary's original purpose. From an archaeological perspective, Belintash endures precisely because of its subtlety. It survived by avoiding extensive reuse, reconstruction, or transformation. In regions where lower landscapes were altered by flooding, erosion, or agricultural development, elevated rock platforms like Belintash remained relatively stable. They preserved traces of ritual behavior long after surrounding environments changed. While no evidence connects the sanctuary to a specific environmental catastrophe, its emphasis on elevation, exposure, and water flow suggests an awareness of forces beyond human control, engaged through observation rather than enclosure. Belintash does not dominate the landscape through mass or height, but through clarity. It offers a surface where sky, stone, and water intersect in ways that can be watched, traced, and remembered. Standing alone above the valleys, the sanctuary resists definitive explanation. Its carvings form a quiet record of engagement with time and natural rhythm, hinting that for those who shaped it, endurance was found not in walls or monuments, but in the careful marking of a place that would remain when so much else passed away.
At the edge of the Sakar Mountains, where the rugged terrain gradually gives way to softer, rolling hills, movement once followed familiar corridors shaped by geography and trade. For centuries, people, animals, and goods passed through this transitional zone on their way toward the Aegean world beyond. It is within this quiet threshold landscape that the Mezek Thracian tomb was constructed, concealed beneath a broad earthen mound whose presence is almost imperceptible from a distance. The tomb reveals itself only through a carefully built stone-lined passage cut into the slope.
This understated entrance offers no dramatic facade or monumental display, yet it signals a deliberate architectural intent. Constructed in the late 4th century BCE, the tomb belongs to a period when Thracian elites were increasingly exposed to architectural ideas circulating through the Hellenistic sphere. Rather than imitating these forms outright, they selectively adapted them, integrating new techniques while maintaining older regional concepts of burial, memory, and ancestral continuity. The entrance corridor is composed of large, precisely fitted stone blocks laid with remarkable care. As the passage descends gently inward, it guides the visitor away from the open landscape above and into an increasingly enclosed world below. This gradual transition appears intentional, creating a controlled psychological shift from the realm of the living to a space set apart for the dead. The architecture does not rush this movement. Instead, it unfolds slowly, emphasizing separation, stillness, and permanence. Beyond the corridor, a sequence of chambers opens one after another. Each space is defined by corbelled stone roofs, a technique that distributes weight through overlapping horizontal layers rather than true arches. The method reflects a sophisticated understanding of load, balance, and long-term stability, achieved without reliance on classical structural solutions. These chambers are not decorative excesses, but carefully calculated volumes designed to endure beneath the weight of the mound above. At the heart of the monument lies the circular burial chamber, monumental in both scale and intent. Its smooth stone walls enclose a space that feels simultaneously protective and final, shaped to outlast surface markers that might erode or disappear over time. Archaeological excavations revealed that the chamber once contained a richly furnished burial. Weapons, vessels, and luxury items were present, many of which were removed in antiquity, leaving the architecture itself as the most enduring expression of status and purpose. Above the chambers, the mound was constructed from layered earth and stone, serving both symbolic and structural roles. It functioned as a visible marker within the landscape while also stabilizing and protecting the spaces below, sealing the interior from moisture and environmental fluctuation. Archaeological context suggests that the tomb belonged to a powerful local ruler or noble lineage. Its placement near established routes of communication, rather than within a densely populated settlement, reinforces its role as a territorial statement as well as a commemorative one. The precision of the construction indicates access to skilled labor, organized resources, and long-standing technical knowledge. Yet despite these advantages, the monument does not dominate its surroundings. Instead, it integrates quietly into the terrain, its visibility diminishing with distance. Structural analysis shows that the builders selected stone types for durability and resistance to water infiltration, drawing on regional experience with subterranean construction rather than experimental innovation. Beneath this technical mastery lies a symbolic language that remains only partially legible. The emphasis on circular space and subterranean depth suggests associations with cyclical time, continuity, and regeneration, concepts deeply embedded in Thracian funerary traditions. The tomb's form aligns with a much older tradition of mound burials that stretches back into prehistory, where earth and stone were combined to anchor lineage and memory across generations. Unlike open-air sanctuaries or monumental temples, the Mezek tomb directs attention inward and downward. Its ritual focus appears centered on containment and preservation rather than visibility or alignment with the sky. Over centuries, the mound endured shifts in agriculture, political authority, and settlement patterns. Its survival owed less to prominence than to its quiet integration within the landscape itself. While no evidence places the tomb outside its established historical period, its architectural lineage draws upon techniques and symbolic ideas far older than the Hellenistic era. Rather than signaling rupture or sudden transformation, it reflects continuity of thought and practice. In regions where surface structures were repeatedly rebuilt, altered, or erased, subterranean monuments such as this offered a more stable vessel for memory, insulated from many of the forces that reshaped the world above. Standing silently beneath its mound, the Mezek tomb speaks neither of catastrophe nor decline. Instead, it conveys control, permanence, and the deliberate shaping of space to resist time. Its stone chambers remain intact long after the identities of those interred have faded, preserving an intention that transcends individual memory. For its builders, endurance itself was the message, carried not upward into the skyline, but downward into the earth.